creepy loop. Get ready for scary stories that'll give you goosebumps. Join us in the woods with a dad and son facing a mysterious creature. Will they make it out? Subscribe for weekly thrills. Relax, kiddo. Close one eye and focus on your target, my dad said calmly from behind me. I tried to do what he said, making my muscles loosen up. I closed one eye to get rid of the double vision caused by the rifle's sight being so close to my face. That's good, he continued. Now, when you're ready, hold your breath. Don't hold it for too long, or you'll start shaking. Just enough. Then, slowly squeeze the trigger down. Like you're milking a cow. I couldn't help but laugh a little. Dad, I've never milked a cow before, I said, looking up at him. He furrowed his brow and adjusted his baseball cap. Well, that's how my dad described it to me. You know what I mean. I smiled and shook my head. This wasn't the first time my dad explained how to shoot to me. Or the second. Or even the third. He liked to repeat himself sometimes, but I didn't mind. I turned my attention back to the target through the sight and concentrated. I relaxed my muscles, closed one eye, and focused on the bullseye at the end of the barrel. Holding my breath, I slowly squeezed the trigger. The rifle jumped in my hands, jerking back heavily. I was a bit nervous since the last time I went to the range, and a scope smacked me in the eye, leaving a bruise and a cut on my brow. I couldn't see from where we stood at the shooting range station, but I felt good about the shot. My dad leaned into the spotting scope we had set up and looked through it. He nodded a little, and I saw his lips curl into a smile. Not bad. Take a look. Not bad. Take a look, my dad said, and I stood up to peek through the scope. It took a moment to focus, but I could see a small, black hole in the target at the other end of the range. It wasn't right in the center, just a bit high into the left. My dad nodded and put his hand on my shoulder. If that was a deer, it'd be a clean hit. I smiled at his words and turned back to him. Do you think I could actually hit something this weekend? I asked. He shrugged and took a breath. It's possible. We'll sure as heck try. Now, see if you can hit the bullseye this time. I chuckled and shook my head. Back to the station I went. I lifted the rifle and focused again. Maybe, with a bit of luck, we might bring back something on this hunting trip. That would be a change. I hadn't shot since that day at the rifle range, but I wasn't too worried. Apparently, I was a pretty decent shot. No bullseyes, but close enough. And I was getting used to the .300 short mag Browning rifles my dad got for us to use. They had a strong kick, but with the padded stocks and a firm grip, you could keep them under control. My dad had been planning this trip for a while and got the 2 Brownings specifically for it. The plan was for my dad, my Uncle John, and me to head up to this out in the middle of nowhere place where my dad used to deer hunt with his father and do the same for the weekend. To be honest, I wasn't really big on the whole outdoors thing. It meant being too hot in the day, too cold at night, bugs everywhere, and a constant overwhelming feeling of needing a shower. However, I wanted to do it for my dad. My dad, Fred, wasn't doing so well. He had cancer and something called vasculitis, which made him very sick. It changed him a lot. A few years ago, he was a strong and fearless man who could make someone back down with just a hard stare. But now, he was much different, skinny and looking like he faced real danger. It scared him, and it made me realize I might not have as much time with him as I thought. My Uncle John, who's my mom's brother, probably felt the same way. John was more of a city person like me. He taught at a local high school and had lots of different hobbies. Lately, he was into photography. Even as we drove up, I could see his fancy new Nikon DSLR camera hanging around his neck. We brought 3 guns with us, the 2 Brownings and my dad's old .30-30 rifle. We didn't expect John to shoot anything unless it was with his camera. I thought my dad brought his old rifle just for nostalgia, as it was the one he used with his father, and he kept it in great condition. Despite the care he gave it, the old rifle was still, well, old. The new Brownings were much better, with brand new scopes and shoulder straps. We were ready in case we came across a deer on our trip. We arrived at our hunting ground in the afternoon. It was a few hours away from our home and another hour driving on a bumpy dirt and gravel road. That was the most boring part. The car couldn't go faster than 15 miles per hour because of all the bumps. Finally, we reached our spot, which was a clearing in the middle of a big group of trees. I don't remember exactly where it was, just that it took quite a while to get there. We set up our camp with a big tent for the three of us. John brought some cool camping cook gear, and my dad had cooked ribs and chicken beforehand. We just needed to warm them up. After setting up, the first thing we did was eat. As we munched on ribs, John asked my dad, "Fred, what are the chances of getting a deer out here?" "As good as anyone else's," my dad shrugged. There was a little pause before John asked another question. "Let's say we get a deer. What do we do then?" John looked at my dad with a raised eyebrow. It seemed like an innocent question, but I knew what he meant. How are we going to handle that heavy deer in the middle of the brush, especially considering my dad's recent health struggles? John cared a lot for my dad, but sometimes he worried too much. Dad lost some strength in the hospital, but he wasn't weak yet. And he didn't like it when people thought he was. "We'll lug it up and carry it back here," my dad answered shortly, a hint of annoyance in his voice. "David can handle it." "Right, son?" He looked at me with a smile. I returned the smile and nodded. "Yeah, I can take care of it. I'm stronger than I look." My dad's smile grew, and John just shrugged. We finished eating, and the sun was starting to go down, showing the first signs of evening. "You know, we'll have a couple of hours before it gets dark," Dad said, looking up at the sky. "You want to take a bit of a walk and see if we get lucky?" "Sure," I quickly replied. "Why not?" John nodded in agreement, and soon, the three of us were walking into the trees. Only Dad and I carried our guns, both brand new Brownings. John was happy with just his camera. Dad led the way through the thin path, remembering moments with his father. I followed behind him, my rifle slung over my shoulder. John was at the back, his hands near his camera. Every now and then, I'd hear a soft click as he took pictures of the scenery. We didn't find much. No deer, and we didn't even see any animals except for random birds and lots of bugs. I was getting tired, and my legs started to hurt. It had been a long day, and I just wanted to sit down and relax before going to sleep. The cold set in as the sun went lower, even through my jacket. Dad kept going until he stopped and bent down. "Find something?" I asked as John and I both came up and looked down at the ground. Dad pointed out something in the soft dirt. There were cloven tracks, like the ones deer make, running along the path. "Deer tracks," he said, smiling a bit. He stood up and followed them along the path. "They go along here, and then..." He trailed off, furrowing his brow and crouching back down. "Then?" I asked as John and I approached. Dad pointed to the ground, and we saw what he was looking at. The prints suddenly shifted and seemed to move toward the forest, off the path. But that's not what was unusual. There were two more footprints in the dirt next to the deer's, pointing in the direction the deer ran off. "Is that a bear?" John asked my dad while he looked at those two prints in the dirt. I thought they might be from a bear too, but they looked strange. My dad noticed it too. Bear prints usually have a certain shape with 5 toes, but these prints had only 3 toes and a long shape where the paw landed. The claw marks above those 3 toes were deep in the ground. It was almost like if a person had 3 toes instead of 5 and had thick, dangerous claws, they would make this footprint. and the size of them made me feel uncomfortable. "Not the right shape," Dad finally said as he stood. "And it's not a mountain lion either." "H.M. Bigfoot?" I asked with a nervous chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, they say he could be out here," Dad remarked with a grin, though I could tell he was just joking to lift the mood. All three of us could feel something wasn't right, a weird feeling starting to set in. A chill ran through me as I stared at those prints, and it wasn't from the cold. "Maybe we should call it a day, before it gets too dark," John suggested. Nobody argued. We turned and started to walk back down the path. I kept a hand on the shoulder strap of the rifle, ready to take it off if I needed to. I noticed Dad was doing the same. We didn't talk much when we got back. John started a fire before it got too dark, and the three of us sat around it as night fell. It felt calm. I could hear the soft chirps of crickets in the woods and the flutter of nighttime birds flying by. We started chatting again, forgetting about those strange prints. John and my dad talked about random things like TV shows and memories my dad had of this area. I sat back and relaxed. Even though I was a city boy, it was nice to be out with my family. I could tell my dad was enjoying himself. He seemed happier, more alive. Maybe the memories of good times were helping him feel better. I hoped making more memories would help him too. We went to bed not long after that. John put out the fire, and the dark night covered the camp. Only the stars and the moon gave enough light for us to get comfortable in the tent. As I drifted off to sleep in my sleeping bag, I noticed one thing. Maybe I was too tired to care, or my mind made me ignore it, but it seemed strange when the sounds of the forest stopped. The crickets stopped chirping, and the movement of hidden nighttime animals ended. I felt a familiar uneasiness building up in my stomach as sleep took over. The same feeling I had when we looked at those strangely shaped tracks with claws that sank deep into the earth below. I woke up from a deep sleep to a delicious smell that hit me right in my belly. Bacon. I got up from my sleeping bag, changed into fresh clothes, and stepped outside the tent. John was at the camping fryer he brought, cooking up a fresh batch of bacon, while my dad checked the guns, getting them ready for today's adventure. "Morning, David." John greeted with a grin, holding up the pan. "Almost done here. Got some eggs, too." "Bacon and eggs in the woods?" I wasn't complaining. We had breakfast happily, joking around and talking about all the ways we'd cook the deer we were sure to catch on this trip. Last night's weirdness was completely forgotten. After breakfast, we cleaned up, and Dad handed me one of the Brownings. "You ready for this, son?" he asked with a smile. I nodded and took the rifle, slinging it over my shoulder. "Oh, yeah. It'll be good to get an early start this time too." Father and son prepared their weapons, and John made sure his camera was ready for the day. He even took a photo of both of us, grinning at the camera. I felt good. It had been a while since my father and I got a chance to do something together. The time in the hospital was long and stressful. I still remember walking into his room, seeing him hooked up to machines, looking like he needed help, but I couldn't do anything. Before that, we went through a rough patch, stupid years of me being a dumb teenager leading up to being a dumb young adult. Now, I felt closer to him than ever. It felt like we were building up the family again. I'll never forget that feeling. Then we walked into the wild, Dad leading the way and John bringing up the rear. We followed the path, keeping our eyes peeled for any movement in the woods and listening for even the slightest sound. Overall, it was a quiet morning that turned into a quiet afternoon. We walked and moved, going over fallen trees that blocked the path and slipping through areas where plants tried to take back the land. I'll admit, I was starting to feel a bit bored and tired. You can only walk for so long without seeing anything before it gets a little disheartening. Dad didn't show any signs of being tired, though. Even after leaving the hospital not too long ago, he moved like he had a purpose. I thought we might come across a tree too big or an overgrown area too thick, but he went through without complaining. It turned out to be worth it all. We stopped as Dad held up a hand, and both John and I froze in awkward poses, putting our feet down mid-walk. In the distance, it took me a moment to see what he was looking at. It was hard to make out through the brush and trees, but I could see the light brown form of a deer. It stood off in the distance, through the trees, lightly grazing on something on the ground. And, lucky for us, it was a buck. 2 sets of large antlers rose from its head, tall and proud, before breaking off into 2 branches on each side. A forked horn, my dad would call it. It didn't seem to see us yet. My dad grinned at me and quietly motioned to the rifle on my shoulder. "You want to take the shot, son?" he whispered. I hesitated, feeling the heavy weight of the gun in my hands. The shot seemed far away, and there was a lot of brush in the way. "And no," I stammered, shaking my head. A bit of embarrassment washed over me. "You do it, Dad." "I don't know if I can hit it that far away." He nodded, turning back and unslinging his own rifle. I hoped he wouldn't be disappointed that I couldn't take the shot. I just didn't want to mess up this moment by missing. We finally found a deer, and I didn't want to ruin it. Dad would get it, though. I was sure of that. He looked around, and I could almost see him silently cursing. He was searching for a place to balance his rifle. Right now, there wasn't a very convenient spot. He always emphasized the importance of steadying your rifle. He drilled that fact into me. Shooting while standing with no rest was the worst way to do it. You only do it if you have to. And if you have to, at least remember everything else. You'll need every advantage to hit something without any kind of rest. Dad ended up sitting down on the dirt, his knees rising up. It wasn't as good as finding a rest for your gun, but you could use your knees to steady both your back elbow and your front as you aimed. The deer's head rose, and it started to look around. Our welcome was wearing thin. Dad aimed down the sight, and I heard him take in a short breath, not daring to let it out. His fingers slowly fell upon the trigger. Bang! The gunshot echoed, and I saw the buck jerk and stumble in the distance. It wobbled for a moment, then sprinted through the trees away from us. My dad stood up, looking after it. John and I finally moved and joined him. "You got it, Fred?" John asked, peering into the distance. "I don't think you got it." "Oh, I got it," Dad said confidently, a smirk on his face. "I got him." He looked at me, and I smiled back. The deer seemed like it got hit, but I couldn't be sure. I preferred to think my dad got him rather than missed. "Should we go after it?" I asked, looking to the spot where the deer had been. "Oh, yeah," Dad replied, pushing on with his rifle slung over his shoulder. "It can't have gone far." So, through the brush, we went, the 3 of us searching for the wounded deer. When we reached the spot where it had lingered, the result was clear. A fresh patch of blood covered a nearby tree and splattered the dirt on the ground. My dad grinned and said, "And I told you so," looked to my uncle before taking a few steps. Sure enough, in the direction the deer ran off, another splash of blood stained the earth. "Got him," my dad declared with a triumphant pump of his fist. "Now, let's get him back. He's not going to be too far, I bet." The blood trail went on for a good distance. Sometimes, I lost the trail, unsure if we took a wrong turn or if the deer had stopped bleeding. My dad kept right on it, and we'd find a new splash of brownish-red mixing with the dirt. The trail led straight to a large, overgrown set of brush that looked squished, like something heavy fell on it. A big pool of blood splattered over the plants and sank into the earth. It seemed like the deer had staggered here and collapsed onto the brush. But there was no deer. Only the blood and torn-up plants showed that something heavy and bleeding had fallen here. My dad adjusted his ball cap again and moved up to investigate. "That's weird. "Looks like he should be right here," he commented, running a hand along one of the bloody leaves. "I don't think he could have gotten up after falling with a hit like that." John and I stepped forward to look. It seemed like something had fallen here. It had to be the deer. What else could have recently been wounded and bleeding? John was the first to notice something strange. He moved around the back of the brush and found an area behind it trampled to the ground. Blood streaked along the leaves and the ground before moving off into the woods. Like something was being dragged. John waved my dad over, who took a look with a thoughtful gaze. "You think something took off with it?" John questioned. "Maybe, but this quick? Doesn't seem possible," Dad sighed, shaking his head. I stood back, both curious and nervous, memories of certain footprints coming back to me. "Let's take a look," John suggested after a moment. "It shouldn't be too far." Curiosity got the best of all of us, and we began to walk in the direction of the blood streaks. These were different from the splotches we saw on the way here. Instead of circular splatters, each bit of the blood trail rolled along the earth in a curving line before stopping, only to resume a few feet onward. I didn't notice the chirping of birds and animals stop or the buzzing of insects cease. I did hear the faint sound of something squishy being torn. Dad must have heard it too, and he slipped the rifle off his shoulder as we all hunkered down and moved as silently as we could. I was the first to see it, and thank goodness for the brush. Otherwise, I might have seen it head on in the daylight. In the distance, through the trees, a creature crouched down over something. It was hard to make out through the brush in distance, but I could distinctly see brownish-black fur or skin and a muzzle. All three of us stopped and watched in awe and silence. Looking closer, I thought I could see patches of fur and blood coating areas of it. It leaned over and bit down into something on the ground, which turned out to be the deer. I could see bits of those forked antlers sticking up. I also saw what looked like a hand raising up, large claws gleaming on a three-fingered hand before it lowered to tear into the meat. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up. This thing made those tracks earlier, I knew it. Dad looked off in quiet shock while John seemed to debate whether or not to take a picture with his camera. Then, the creature snapped its head up, and I caught my first look at gleaming, bloodshot red eyes. It stared directly at us. A screech emitted from it, high-pitched and grating, like the sound was tearing apart its throat. It launched itself in our direction, still screeching that ghastly sound. Dad rose to his feet, angling the gun as he yelled something to John and me. I assumed it was run because John turned and took off. I rose and held my ground as Dad fired off a shot that I knew would miss. Through the trees and with a moving target, he'd be lucky to hit it with a rest, but standing? No chance. The shot made the thing veer off into the trees to our right. Dad turned and began to run himself. I bolted off with him, my heart jumping into my throat as I ran. I could hear the trees crashing on our right side, then on our left. Could it switch that quickly? That screech emitted again, and this time, I felt like the terrified deer running through the woods as impending death loomed over me. I don't know how long Dad and I ran, but enough that I felt my legs start to cramp up and my breath wheeze. Dad wasn't looking too hot either. He stumbled and gulped in ragged gasps of air. His recent issues must have been finally catching up. Still, he pushed on, and I did with him. I never left his side, even as he slowed. Like heck was I going to leave him while that thing was chasing us. I could tell he wanted me to push forward, to leave him and escape on my own. My mind went to a joke my dad used to tell about two campers and one bringing running shoes. The other asks why he brought running shoes and if he expected to outrun a bear. His friend answers, "No, I just have to outrun you." Well, this wasn't a joke. I don't know how we managed it, but soon the two of us burst into our campsite, gasping and wheezing for air. Dad coughed and moved over to the car, leaning against it with an arm up. He coughed and spat as I bent over and gasped. I looked up to see him still coughing and lurching, and I felt my stomach twist. He wasn't doing well. Slowly, I came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "Dad?" I asked quietly. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he spoke in a ragged voice between coughs. I'm okay." "Are you okay?" He still worried about me when he was the one that looked like he would cough up a lung. "I'm all right," I reassured him before I lifted my head. That's when I realized something as I looked around our solitary campsite. John was nowhere in sight. I stepped away from Dad, my eyes looking around the camp. It looked untouched, just the way we left it this morning. But John wasn't here. I looked back to Dad, who seemed to finally recover and push himself away from the car. "John's not here," I told him as I looked around. My dad cursed, and his gaze wandered back toward the woods, where that creature had been. My eyes followed him, and I swallowed down some of the bacon and eggs that tried to come back up. "You think he's out there? You think that thing?" "We'll find him," my dad cut me off as he drew in a breath. "Get some fresh water ready for us and some food. Make sure you got ammo," he commanded. I didn't question him. I moved and refilled our canteens with water and stuffed some of the quick snack foods we brought with us into small bags. I double-checked my ammunition and found my clip still full. I hadn't fired a shot. Dad moved to the car and pulled out a box of .300 short mag rounds before setting it on the hood. The clip in his rifle came out, and he replaced the 2 shots he fired swiftly before oddly hesitating as he went to slip the clip back in. Instead, he turned to me and extended the clip out. "Here, son. That'll give you an extra one," he said firmly as I gave him an odd look. "Dad, what about you?" I asked as I lifted my hand to take the full clip from him. He turned back toward the car and reached in again, soon slipping out his old .30-30 rifle. Without a second thought, he began to load it with ammo from an old and beat-up .30-30 box he had brought with him. I shook my head and came up next to him. "No, Dad. That gun's old. And we're going to need power if we come across that thing. We have a short magnum, Dad. The .30-30. Is my gun," he replied quickly and curtly. "It's reliable. I used this gun for 30 years, and it still shoots like it's brand new." "I know it, and it'll be plenty. Besides, you got the short mag." After loading the rounds, he turned and put a hand on my shoulder. "We can take care of it. Now, are you ready?" I looked away from him into those woods. Those same woods, which, before this moment, did not seem so dark or ominous. Even in the daylight, the trees seemed to suck up the light like a vampire, leaving shadows where a sickening, patchy-furred monster might be waiting to creep up on us and tear us apart. "We're going after John?" I asked as I kept my gaze focused on that forest, trying to pierce the darkness and hoping I didn't find 2 bloodshot eyes staring back at me. "We're going to get him back." A deep breath, and I nodded before slipping the extra clip into my pocket. My hands went to unsling the rifle from my shoulder, and I finally looked back to my father. "Okay," I spoke, my voice coming out much quieter than I meant it to. "Let's go." Our search began in late afternoon, while the sun seemed like it was in a losing battle of staying high in the sky. Journeying back into those woods while that thing was still out there terrified me like hell. I had already witnessed it tearing apart that deer, and now John was missing. I secretly hoped he just got lost on the way back, and we'd find him trying to get back to the path. I hated to think I was hoping he was just lost, but the alternative meant that monster. I pushed those scary thoughts away and held onto my rifle tightly. I glanced over at Dad as we walked. He stepped carefully and quickly, keeping an eye on everything around us. Every now and then, he'd stop and listen before moving on. I was happy he knew how to hunt. It would be a big help. But I could tell he was nervous. The hands holding his trusted gun were shaking a bit. "Oh, Dad," I felt the same fear. the sky got darker, and we kept searching. Luckily, all I heard and saw were bugs and little animals running around. No creature yet. But that didn't mean it wasn't still out there, watching and waiting. Suddenly, I saw Dad stop and crouch down by a big tree. I followed him carefully and quietly. He picked up what looked like the crushed remains of a fancy camera. It was smashed, with the body broken and the lens torn off. The worst part was the smears of blood on the camera and the strap. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I turned and threw up. My body toppled over as I emptied the last of my bacon and eggs onto the forest floor. Dad didn't say anything. He just looked down and sighed. He knew. We both knew. As I knelt on the ground, trying to feel better, I saw my dad stand up and walk off through the trees. After a few deep breaths, I pulled myself up and ran after him. He walked for a bit, sometimes looking down at the ground and then back up. I didn't dare look. I knew what he was following. I just didn't want to believe it. Soon, the smell hit me. The sharp, metallic scent of fresh blood stung my nose, and I held my breath. No, this can't be it. We're going to find a deer. A bear. Well, anything but this. I tried to calm myself down. I just lied to myself. We found John. My dad tracked the blood smears I refused to look at to a big one splattered against the tree. He was slumped over in the branches, hanging down as drops of blood fell to the base of the tree, mixing with wood and dirt. I only looked for a moment before I had to turn away, but it was enough to see the gouge marks on his arm that hung limply over the branch, swaying in the light wind, and the bits of flesh and intestine threatening to spill out with the slightest movement. My dad grimaced and curled his lip. He just stared up, and I could see moisture building in his eyes. He looked from the tree to me, and I knew what was going through his head. John was dead. My uncle and his brother-in-law were dead. And the two of us were still stuck here with the killer. I was in danger. I knew what he was seeing in his head. Dad saw me, hung up in that tree, blood dripping along a lifeless body. He turned away quickly and reached a hand to grab my shoulder. "We're leaving," he said so quickly and quietly it took me a moment to understand. Already, he began to drag me through the trees back toward camp. I moved along listlessly, in a daze from the recent events. It was getting to be too much. One of us was already dead, and we could very well join him soon. I bit back tears and moved faster. I wanted out. I wanted home. I wanted away from this sickening thing. Darkness quickly filled the woods. I didn't realize how long we were searching until night fell upon the area. As darkness surrounded us, our pace increased. It almost felt like we were running again back to camp. My thoughts went back to this afternoon. I nearly choked as the fresh memory of that creature screeching and chasing after us came to mind. I could almost hear it out there, running along with us through the trees, ready to pounce and rip us to shreds. I sighed with relief when my dad and I slipped back into the camp clearing. He didn't hesitate. He took one last look around for John and then headed for the car. "What about our stuff?" I asked as I came up behind him, pointing to our gear. We still had our tent, cooking supplies, food, and everything else lying about. "We don't need it," Dad said as he threw open the car door. "It's all Rep Lack Dash." That screech, that terrible screech cut him off. From the side of the car, I saw it. It burst out and reared up. I only saw it up close for a second, but it felt like more. It seemed like I had enough time to see every detail. The reason why its brownish-black fur looked patchy seemed to be because there were parts of its black skin that looked diseased and rotted. It was tall and scrawny, overly scrawny with bones that jut out in a way that made them seem like they'd tear through thin skin at any moment. It had a canine-like muzzle with jaws that opened into thick and sharp, yellowed fangs. It reared up on thin, back legs that ended in elongated three-toed feet equipped with 3 long claws that dug into the earth where it stood. A three-clawed hand smacked my dad in the chin, flinging him back to the ground. His rifle dropped a few feet away. The creature turned toward me, its blood-red eyes locking onto mine. I stared in shock as it snarled, sickly drool oozing from its jaws. I remembered my rifle and raised it, but the creature's arm shot out, grabbing the barrel and wrenching it away with surprising strength. I backed up, about to run, when it leapt at me. A heavy form crashed over me, knocking me into the hard dirt. I smelled the creature's awful odor, rotting flesh and dried blood. I thought, I'm going to die now. God, I'm dead. It raised a clawed hand. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed, the smack of something hard against flesh. The creature stumbled off me, and I crawled away, panting heavily. I dared to look back and saw my dad standing there, both hands clenched in front of him after delivering a powerful blow to the creature's back. I didn't know he had that strength left in him. The monster recovered, hissing and screeching at my father. He glanced at me, and my breath caught. He wasn't trying to defeat it, he wanted to distract it, to get it away from me. My dad was willing to sacrifice himself to save me. The creature rose and swiped at Dad with its claws, leaving 3 cuts on his arms. He fell backward to the ground. I needed to do something. I needed to get up and run. Dad was sacrificing himself for me, and all I could do was sit and watch. As I pushed myself up, my hand brushed against something metal. I looked down and saw Dad's .30-30 lying next to me. The creature moved forward, looming over my fallen father and pinning him down. I quickly grabbed the gun, trying to remember what Dad taught me about shooting. If you can help it, son, always find something to balance your gun on. Don't ever shoot it just holding it unless you have to. I adjusted my position, sitting down and raising my knees to rest the gun on them, just like Dad did when shooting a deer. Dad yelled something at me, but I couldn't hear it over the creature hissing. Relax, son. Close one eye and keep focused on your target. I rolled my shoulders, forcing my muscles to relax, and closed one eye, aiming at the drooling head of the monster. The creature opened its mouth and screeched in Dad's face, drool oozing over him as he shut his eyes and turned away. Now, when you're ready, hold your breath. Don't hold it for too long, or you're gonna start shaking. Just enough. I took in a breath and held it, the gun steadying in my hands as my breathing paused for a moment. The creature's arm rose, claws ready to strike my father. I knew I had one chance, and if I missed, my dad would be in danger. Then, slowly squeeze the trigger down. Like you're milking a cow, Dad's voice echoed in my head. I imagined milking a cow as my fingers slowly squeezed the trigger. The creature's clawed hand fell downward. Bam! The shot rang out, and I heard a sick crunching noise mixed with a splatter. The creature howled, releasing my dad from its grip. Its oversized hands clutched its head in pain, blood pouring from the side of its deformed skull. It stumbled and snarled at me before running back into the woods. I sat there in silence, panting, sweat pouring down my face. My eyes moved back to my dad, lying there not moving. I swiftly rose and slid down next to him. Dad! I cried out. Dad! Come on! He blinked and stared up at me before his arms wrapped around me in a tight hug. I hugged him back, relieved that we were both okay. Soon, my father let go and pushed himself up to his feet. Glancing back toward the woods, he wiped some of the foul-smelling drool from his face. I. He stammered, placing a hand on my shoulder. I taught you good. I chuckled softly. We didn't waste any time, we got into the car and drove. Neither of us spoke until the car pulled onto the solid highway nearly an hour later. I was the first to break the silence. What do you think it was? I asked quietly, turning my head toward him. I don't know, was his only reply. What are we going to say about John? The truth. He was attacked by an animal. We shot it, but we think it got away. He sighed, hanging his head. I knew he felt responsible for John. It wasn't his fault, though. That thing, that monster, was to blame. And nobody would believe us if we said a monster got him. So, an animal. It had to be an animal. We stayed quiet for a little while longer before I spoke up in a quiet, nervous voice. What if that thing comes back? I asked, focusing my eyes on my father. What if it follows us? Comes after us again? Surprisingly, my dad smirked. He shook his head confidently. I'm not scared if it does. His words surprised me. I gave him an odd look, wondering if he had gone a bit crazy. Dad, that thing took a bullet to the face, and you're not scared of it? Son, he began, glancing at me with a confident expression. You shot that thing in the head, and it howled and ran away. That means it was hurt. It means it was scared of getting hurt more. And if it's scared of getting hurt more, his grin grew wider. That means we could kill it. How did the protagonist steady the rifle before taking a shot at the deer? What item did the protagonist find near a large tree that revealed the fate of their missing companion, John? In the final confrontation with the creature, what advice did the father give to the protagonist about shooting the rifle? What was the protagonist's concern about the creature possibly returning, and how did the father respond? Enjoy more thrilling stories like this by subscribing to the Creepy Loop channel. Don't miss out on the spine-chilling tales and exciting adventures. Subscribe now to stay updated on the latest creepy content.